Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for this second event of a two-part event on the presidential election 2020. Tonight we are going to ask ourselves the question, where do we go from here? We're grateful to have you here with us this evening. My name is Maeve DeVoy, and I am the Associate Director of the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life at UC Santa Barbara. I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of the center's director, Professor Greg Johnson. As I mentioned a moment ago, we would be thrilled to have you join us on Thursday, November 12th, as Professor Carla Fredericks of the University of Colorado Law School will be the second featured speaker in our fall symposia series on ethics in place, Indigenous peoples and the future of principled democracy. Fredericks will speak on names, naming, and the mascot controversies, and how it speaks to the ethical frameworks for investing and divesting relative to Native peoples. You may find the Zoom link on our website, capcenter.ucsb.edu, as well as on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Shoreline. And we hope you'll join us. Before we begin this evening, we would like to acknowledge that UC Santa Barbara is located on the unceded ancestral lands of the Chumash people. Tonight's event is a nonpartisan educational event. UC Santa Barbara and the Capps Center do not engage in any activity in support of or opposition to any candidates for public office. Any views expressed by participants in this event, including those affiliated with UCSB, are their own and do not represent the views of the University of California or of the Capps Center, which operate exclusively for educational and nonpartisan purposes. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank our many co-sponsors for this event. Our thanks go to the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, the Blum Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy, the Center for Black Studies Research, the Educational Opportunity Program, Feminist Futures Initiative, the Gauchos Vote Coalition, KCSB, the Multicultural Center, and Student Engagement and Leadership. In addition, we thank Dr. Viviana Marzano, Alma Loaiza Mendoza, Patricia Garcia, Sean Lemons, Aubrey Valerio, Ashley Rush, Lisa Osborne, Jennifer Kaiser, Dr. Joanne Nowak, Aaron Jones, Simone Stewart, and Warsan Ali, and we are very grateful to all of you. This event is live streaming on Facebook, and we are also recording it. The video will be available soon on our social media accounts and on our website. KCSB, our campus radio station, is taping the show and will broadcast it in the coming days at 91.9 FM. Our thanks again to our friends at KCSB. The event's format will be that of a panel discussion. We are fortunate to have with us tonight two UCSB faculty members who will offer some insights and thoughts on where we are, where we as a country go from here after a bitter campaign and post-election rancor. Professor Salim Yaqub comes to us from the Department of History, where he specializes in U.S. diplomatic history. Professor Yaqub will speak to us about what we might expect with regard to U.S. foreign relations come January 20th, when President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris are sworn into office. Professor Terrance Wooten will also offer his thoughts about where we go as a nation in the aftermath of the election. Professor Wooten is on the faculty of the Department of Black Studies, and he is faculty in residence at the Multicultural Center. After Professors Yaqub and Wooten speak, we will engage in a discussion with our panel of undergraduate and graduate students, whom Professor Wooten will soon introduce. Our conversation with the panelists will be followed by Q&A from the audience. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. We may not get to all of your questions, but we sincerely appreciate all of your questions. The CAP Center is dedicated to the promotion of civil discourse, and participants have thus agreed to the following community agreement. Everyone has an equal voice. We listen with the goal of understanding. We assume goodwill and positive intent. We acknowledge that we may disagree, but we will not personalize or engage in name-calling or stereotyping. Our event this evening is in keeping with the 2-decade-long tradition of the CAP Center of exploring matters that are of great import to our political life. As we have seen, turnout in the national election hit a 50-year high, with 65% of eligible voters participating. An unprecedented 100 million Americans voted before November 3rd, braving voter suppression, extraordinarily long waits in line, disinformation campaigns designed to discredit the long-standing tradition of voting by mail, and an effort to subvert the United States Postal Service. On top of all of this, the greatest public health catastrophe of our lifetime, as the coronavirus rages unchecked throughout the country, having claimed as of today the lives of 240,000 Americans and infecting over 10.3 million more. 2020 has been a punishing and searing year for all of us. And yet, despite it all, Americans came out in droves to cast their votes, and they did so decisively. 160,000 Americans voted in this presidential election. There was, as predicted, an election night red mirage caused by a lopsided percentage of Republicans voting in person on November 3rd and a heavily Democratic mail-in vote. Subsequently, mail-in vote numbers have taken longer to show up in the vote totals since November 3rd. The actual result, it seems, is that this race was not particularly close. President-elect Biden will likely, in the end, have won 306 electoral votes. He and our first female person of color to be elected vice president will have won more than 75 million votes, the most ever in a national election. And President-elect Biden will have prevailed over his opponent by a margin of somewhere between 4 and 5 million votes cast. At the same time, the losing candidate earned the second largest number of votes in our history, a somewhat surprising fact that should cause all of us to think deeply about how we might understand his appeal to so many Americans. That topic would seem to be of great import when we ask ourselves, where do we go from here? It's my privilege now to introduce my friend, Professor Salim Yaqub of the Department of History. Professor Yaqub will speak to us about the US and the world. Salim. You're muted.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me now? Great. Thanks so much, Maeve. I really appreciate your invitation and that of the CAP Center. Also, it's great to be able to spend time with the other panelists and with all of the people who are tuning in. I should apologize for the disheveled nature of my office. I'm not going to score any high marks on Room Raider, that's for sure. And also, just seconds ago, I became aware of the presence of a moth flying around in my office. So if I lurch and flinch uncontrollably, that will be the reason, or that may be the reason, I should say. So yeah, because I'm speaking for just, is it 10 minutes? I'm going to have to speak very, very generally, and not really get into the nitty-gritty of U.S. relations with any particular country. So, and also I want to cover a fairly long period of time for reasons that will become clear in a second, and that will make me be even more general. But what I want to start by doing is just sketch out the way the United States has related to the world in the period prior to President Trump's ascendancy. I mean, this goes back to the end of World War II for sure, but to some extent earlier, into the beginning of the 20th century, which was as follows. The United States basically had tried to create a global system where as many participants as possible adhered to a set of rules, and did so because they found it to be in their interest to do so. Now, those rules definitely benefited the United States more than any other country. It was the most powerful, the wealthiest country in the system. So in a material sense, it benefited. And it also benefited, you might say, psychically, by being at the top of this heap, being the hegemon. But the idea was that if you put in place this system that a substantial number of countries have a stake in, they will willingly join that system. They will benefit, I mean, the United States will benefit more than anybody else, but they will benefit enough to ensure their participation. And now, of course, there are all kinds of limitations and exceptions to this system, ways in which the United States did not live up to the standards it was proclaiming for itself and demanding of others. Certainly very violent and oppressive behavior on the part of the United States. But when it did so, it was usually violating the principles that it was claiming to be observing. And so that gave other countries and other actors in the system a basis for criticizing, for pushing back, and in some cases, readjusting the balance a bit in their own favor. So that's basically the order that had prevailed up until the presidency of Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump very pointedly rejected that whole idea, the whole notion that you want to act in a sort of enlightened self-interest. You want to participate in a system that benefits others in the faith that you will benefit too. His approach was much more narrow, looking at the narrow interests of the United States, and as we discovered, the narrow interests of Donald Trump personally. What's in it for the United States and what's in it for me. And so you can see that the way he approached various projects that the United States had engaged in for decades, for example, taking part in the United Nations, or having an alliance, overseeing an alliance system. He very pointedly rejected that whole idea. You see this very clearly in the case of NATO, where he would openly ask, well, what are we getting out of it? The United States is contributing so much more. We have a much bigger military establishment. We spend so much more of our GNP on the military. and everybody else is freeloading. And what he was either failing to understand or rejecting was that that was the basic calculation that American governments had made for decades, which is that, yes, the United States contributes more, but what it gets back in return is so much, is definitely worth it. And just to make a very, give you a point to a very quick example, the benefit of having Germany as part of NATO, as opposed to the system that had prevailed in the first half of the 20th century, when Germany was just on its own, is pretty clear. You want Germany tethered to a global international alliance rather than unmoored from one. But the way Trump saw it was, well, look at how much we're spending on NATO. How much is Germany spending? It's a much smaller share. We're getting gypped. And you'll see a similar sort of approach to international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord, or the agreement to limit Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons capability, and so forth. Also, the United States no longer participating in the World Health Organization. And it's very striking that during the presidency of Donald Trump, and in particular, when the COVID-19 crisis hit, nobody looked to the United States for leadership. It was, now perhaps had this occurred in the first year or two of Trump's presidency, there would have been kind of a vestigial impulse to look to the United States to see what it could do. But by 2020, nobody was looking to the United States for leadership. And that's, in some sense, by design on the part of Donald Trump. So what we can expect to see with the Biden presidency is an attempt to restore the previous situation in which the United States, is overseeing this global system that, for all the reasons I described, is one in which other countries presumably have a stake, and the United States benefits most of all. And so he will, of course, have to focus primarily on COVID-19, both domestically and internationally. So I would expect that a significant aspect of US diplomacy after Biden takes office is coordinating, helping to coordinate a global response in addition to the national response that we need to coordinate. And obviously, assuming that this vaccine proves out, and is something that we want to distribute, then it will need to be distributed globally. And that's going to impose all kinds of challenges, or pose all kinds of challenges that, I think the Biden administration would take very seriously and do its best to perform in an effective manner. We can expect that there will be an effort to get back into the climate accord, and I would also imagine there would be an effort to get back into the to revive the agreement with the multilateral agreement over Iran's nuclear capabilities. I mean, that's going to be difficult because this situation has deteriorated very significantly in the last few months, or the last 2 years really, since the United States pulled out. And there's a huge amount of trust that the United States has lost, rightfully so. And whether it can regain the confidence of the other parties to that agreement is a very daunting challenge. I also, just want to say, I know I don't have a whole lot more time, but there's one other matter of great urgency, which strictly speaking is not diplomatic, but it touches on another aspect of the US role in the world. And, perhaps some people taking part in this conversation will view this skeptically, but nonetheless, the notion that the United States is an example for other countries to follow. and that it represents the kind of society that other countries and people throughout the world aspire to emulate. And it's a place that people throughout the world wish to go, not simply because it's prosperous, but because it's a place where the rule of law prevails, where there is, some effort to address the kinds of inequalities and injustices that occur in every society and occur in very particular ways in ours. This is something that I would argue the Biden administration would feel some urgency to repair. And one, policy prong that I suspect he will pursue as a way of doing that is addressing the crisis on the border and reuniting the children who have been taken away from their families. I mean, this is a matter of extraordinary urgency, for first and foremost for humanitarian reasons, but also I think I'm sure that the Biden administration sees it this way, and I see it this way too. It's vital in resetting the role of the United States globally and recovering some sense of honor that Americans can feel as they relate to other members of the global community. So I think I've probably exhausted my time, so I'm going to end it there. And thank you for your attention, and I look forward to what everybody else has to say as well. I cannot hear anybody else.
I'll learn one of these days.
Okay, there you go.
My apologies. So thank you very much, Salim, for your remarks and for joining us. Our next speaker is Professor Terrance Wooten of the Department of Black Studies, and he is also a visiting faculty at the Multicultural Center on campus. So Terrance, if you will.
Hi, thank you. And for those of you who are tuning in, to the panelists, I have to also say that I got the pleasure of being a part of the first conversation prior to the elections, and I look forward to hearing your comments, Salim, for that amazing overview that I'm going to not successfully emulate. So I have written some things that there's what I thought I was going to write in preparation for this and what I wrote. And so I'm going to read what I wrote. It's not going to be nearly as eloquent and maybe potentially as incisive, but it's where I'm currently sitting in my body. So in preparing words for this event, I made it a point to document my reactions as the votes rolled in on Tuesday. As I stayed up until 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time when reporting had died down, I was in the state of West Virginia, where I grew up until 2 days ago. Over the next day, as reporters and political talking heads speculated about the direction in which the votes would land, and until Thursday, when those light red states became light blue states, all the way up until Saturday at 11:25 a.m. when the Associated Press declared Joe Biden the winner, I was anxious. I meant to give some meaningful reflection on my experience, noting the subtle changes, the relief I felt at 11:26, the excitement about how many people participated in the political process, the joy of having the first Black woman vice president, and so much more. But as I boarded my plane, double masked, hand sanitizer in one pocket, disinfectant wipes in the other, I realized the only thing that I felt was the same anxiety I had going into the election, the same anxiety I've had since Amy Barrett was hastily confirmed to the Supreme Court, a potential blow to a number of protections for racial minorities and especially women's rights. And Justices Thomas and Alito declared they wanted to revisit the court's ruling on same-sex marriage. Since Breonna Taylor was murdered by the police in Kentucky during a no-knock raid and Black people were told that the damages to the built environment and the potential to injure unknown others was more valuable than our own lives, the parents of Aiyana Jones were also reminded that nothing has changed since their then 7-year-old daughter was murdered in the same way a decade ago. I've had this anxiety since the pandemic began, since children were being placed in cages and families ripped apart at the border as part of business as usual to which everyone wants to so quickly return, since Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed, since Betsy DeVos and Ben Carson, since Trump, since. As I looked out the window over Ohio and Indiana, then Missouri and Kansas, from my flight, open image of the election results map on my laptop, I couldn't help but think about the Negro Motorist Screen Book, the annual guidebook for Black road trippers published during the Jim Crow era. It was used to help Black people find lodging in gas stations and restaurants that would serve them, to avoid sundown towns and give them tips on how to engage local community to avoid being harassed, threatened, and maybe even murdered. I felt like I had the Green Book on my laptop screen, made possible by the over 71 million people who voted for Donald Trump. But oh, then Georgia, how it peeked out at me from the corner of my eye with its baby blue hue, reminding me of those community organizers who were fighting on the ground to change history. Stacey Abrams, Nsé Ufot, Helen Butler, Rebecca Dehart, Deborah Scott, Tamika Atkins, and so many more. I remember that we gained a record-breaking 6 new Native American and Native Hawaiian to the House of Representatives, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. The first out transgender state senator with Sarah McBride in Delaware, and Taylor Small in Vermont as the 5th out transgender state legislator in the US history. I go back to Georgia still smiling at me, where there will be runoffs for the 2 US Senate positions, which will determine control of the Senate. But oh, then I remember how Georgia's runoff law was designed by racist lawmakers to undermine Negro block voting by requiring a majority vote for any particular candidate, a method popular across the former Confederacy. I landed in LAX at a little over 11:30 p.m., having gotten little to no sleep given the uncertainty of our future as a nation, with Trump threatening to challenge the outcome on the basis of quote unquote illegal votes. Now votes are illegal, people are illegal, borders division, sitting with the reality that a racist system will help determine our future. Here, I don't just mean that runoff election system, I also mean the Electoral College. And the fact that neither Joe Biden nor Kamala Harris align with the vision of the future I want, but instead felt like a kind of thickening agent to clog up the rapidly developing machine that was expediting with impunity the process of devaluing and killing Black and brown, queer, trans, and gender nonconforming, disabled, and undocumented individuals. I barely slept. Every day comes with some new level of uncertainty and anxiety. I have a spout of hopefulness for our nation as I think about what a new administration's response to this pandemic might look like, and how the very things I teach, critical race theory, debunking American exceptionalism, white privilege, etc., might no longer be on the chopping block. And the fact that I say that almost sounds ridiculous, but it was. I think about how representation with all its flaws matter and what it means for a nation to now have a Black woman, HBCU graduate, Black sorority member, daughter of an Indian cancer researcher and Jamaican economics professor as the vice president-elect. We have work to do. Joe Biden said the election was about the character of our nation. Pundits have repeatedly mentioned how much more divided our nation is. As a scholar in Black studies, none of this seems new to me because it's not. Instead, I'm reeling for the backlash, what Carol Anderson has described as white rage that is to come. I'm waiting for the new tent cities or freedom villages to emerge like they did from 1960 to 1962 in Tennessee, when white property owners evicted more than 400 African-American families from their lands simply for voting. This election wasn't about our character. This election showed us who we are. Those Proud Boys do not disappear on January 20th, 2021, nor were they created 4 years ago. Today, I look back to Georgia and all the counties all over the country that are turning sky blue to think about who we can unbecome. I take note from those community activists and organizers who have been working to build a new world for us outside of and despite the US political system, which has been structured to uphold empire. I gain hope from the growing progressive camps within the Democratic Party who continue to push the party to think differently about the economy, healthcare, funding for education, defunding the police and redistributing those funds to evidence-based systems of care that are known to actually intervene in the transmission of violence, and a more aggressive stance on climate change. At the same time, the Republican Party seems to be also taking itself to task through the rise of the Lincoln Project, which is decisively in opposition to the Trumpism rampant in the party. I look forward to hearing from our panelists today as they help us think through this moment and the what comes after. And with that, I would like our panelists to introduce themselves.
Thank you for those very powerful words. My name's Elisa. I'm a 3rd year religious studies and political science double major. I'm one of the undergrad panelists, and I look forward to discussing further of how this impacts us and where we move on from here.
Hello, I'm Laith. I'm a fourth year political science and applied stats and data science major. I'm excited to see where this goes because last time we had great feedback from KCSB, the dean of the vice chancellor of the students, and the Santa Barbara News Press. So I'm really excited to be back and talk to everyone else.
Hi everyone, my name is Melissa Bartholomew. I'm a doctoral candidate in public history here at UCSB and doing a designated emphasis in feminist studies. And prior to coming to UCSB, I did a law degree at Golden Gate University School of Law and have a bachelor's and master's in United States history focused on constitutional issues. So I'm really excited to be in this panel. I'm really happy to have the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement as one of the co-sponsors because I got to be a fellow with the center last year and they have a lot of programming up. So sorry, just had to do a shout out to them. Thanks so much.
Hi, my name is Shakir Stephen. I'm a PhD student in the Religious Studies Department. I'm excited to be back on the panel again. I think we had a good conversation last time and we have a lot to work with now.
Well, welcome you all again. And with that, we'll jump into the first question. So we appreciate your agreeing to participate in this public forum on the presidential election. As we all know, we have been through a very tumultuous week since November 3rd as we near the end of a turbulent, fraught, and difficult year for the country. When we last convened, we asked you to say a bit about how you felt about taking part in a public forum on political issues. We would like to begin by asking you again to tell us how you are feeling about taking part in this public discussion of politics.
I guess I can speak a little bit on that. I think once again, I'm excited to talk with everyone about what we're facing. And I'm also comfortable because like I said, the first time around, we do have a set of community guidelines that we all agreed to. And so I know how this panel will go and I know it won't become a huge argument. Again, I would like to touch upon the fact that in my personal life, I am not super adamant to talk about politics, especially with people I don't know, out of fear that that will become an argument. But I do think that in this moment, we do have a lot of unknowns, like the Georgia runoff, like whether or not Trump will concede. And I think those discussions are important and can be proactive instead of argumentative. And I think those discussions are important to have with people you are close with to understand how we can move forward in a personal sense and then broader as a community.
Yes, Laith.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know what was going next. So it was the first one, right? Okay. Yeah, so off of what Alyssa was saying, I'm excited to see what was going to happen. Well, before we get
I think you've frozen up a bit, Laith.
We
Why
can,
don't
Melissa, and then Laith will come back to you.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Whew, it's been a rough week. It's been an emotional roller coaster, up and down. I would say I kind of have felt wishing California could secede and we could make San Francisco the new capital. So that's kind of where I've been emotionally. I'm excited to participate in the discussion tonight. I think for me, I'm still as much emotionally processing things as I am intellectually. Like I was thinking about it and I know it's really difficult to unseat an incumbent president in the past 30 years. The only time that happened was when Clinton defeated George H.W. Bush in 1992. I know it's really hard when there's, any kind of national emergency. A lot of times we think of when it's war, this time's like a global pandemic. So I know in some ways for me, being very liberal, like I'm excited that Biden and Harris won. A little shocked it was as close as it was. So even if intellectually I can understand it, emotionally, it's a little bit hard for me to be still looking at 71 million people voting for Trump, but I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Okay, welcome back.
Yeah, so my internet cut off, it kind of shut down. Yeah, so when we last convened, we talked about the political issues that have been around us. With Biden coming into office, I'm really interested in seeing how he's going to approach the international community, especially with him being on Trump's previous, not Trump, excuse me, Obama's previous cabinet, being his vice president previously. There's been a lot of concerns, especially how he dealt with the Middle East in foreign relations and leaders. And now that Trump has put with the whole problems that have happened in Israel, especially, how he's going to address those. I'm really interested in seeing how Joe Biden will create peace in the Middle East again, how he'll deal with Saudi Arabia, how he'll deal with North Korea, China, and especially going back into the Paris Agreement, NATO. I'm super interested in seeing how his international policies will play out moving forward.
I'm feeling a little, it feels a kind of similar to the last time we got together to talk about this, but in a way, actually a little more important, because we're talking before the election, we're not changing anyone's minds necessarily. We're not assuming that everybody's on the fence at that point in time. We're just all sort of preparing to have to deal with whatever it is that comes up. And now we actually have a sense of what colors these different layers of the government are going to be in terms of what priorities are going to necessarily be able to sort of move through a chain. And it really is quite a layered set of government. So seeing what that is now, it kind of, it brings up the sense that we know what system we're dealing with. Or at least we know who some of the major actors are in the system that we're dealing with. But systems are never really easy to navigate, whatever color they end up being, and whatever colors different layers of those systems end up being. So now is where you sort of take stock of what that is and try to move in a direction based on the kind of contingency that you feel around that. So in a way, it actually feels a little more poignant right now to actually speak to how we would deal with this kind of system, because it's not as nebulous as it might have been before. So I'm happy to talk now as I was before, and in a way, it almost feels like there's more to work with now.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for all of your thoughtful answers. When we gathered before the presidential election, which, believe it or not, was only 2 weeks ago, think about that. Seems like much longer somehow. We asked you then what was at stake for you on the November 11th election, and you each named the political issues that were at the forefront of your thinking as you decided for whom to vote on November 3rd. How would you answer that question today? Are your main concerns unchanged, or have the events of the last week, for example, altered your thinking in any way? And you may answer in any order that you'd like.
I'll take this one first. I think that in terms of issues I thought were important, priorities, they're the same. Those don't necessarily change for me depending on how an election goes or what's going on. There's still things I think are important. There's still things that I maybe haven't noticed. I'm still listening for those kinds of things. But kind of seeing the way that this is actually rolled out and where we're at as a nation on both sides in regards to an election like this, it does kind of change some expectations about how quickly things might go and which things might be possible. And so honestly, whether or not I think something's going to happen quickly or whether or not I think something is imminently possible doesn't really change if it's important to me or not. The things are really the same. I'm still working for those things. I'll still try to do what I think I can do around those things. But I mean, this is a lot of new information about what the country looks like, where people are at, what people think we should do first. And there's new information around what's possible because there really are different possibilities created by different organizations of certain parties at different levels of government. So looking at that information, I'll take stock of those priorities, and they'll probably stay the same. But the expectations around what's going to happen by leaving them there are, some of them a little different, some of them are maybe the same. Some of them have nothing to do with who is president, with which party is president, or which party is controlling the executive branch. But some of them do. And so, over time, seeing how this rolls out, will probably take stock of that. But for now, very similar priorities to before when we were asked a couple weeks ago.
Okay.
I have to agree with that. I would say I have very similar priorities that I did when we first talked about the issue. I think one thing I am looking very closely at, and will be looking closely at once Biden assumes office, is who he appoints to his cabinet and who he appoints through appeals courts and district courts when federal judges leave those positions. So I am very curious of who will take over those positions and who he will continue to appoint as his presidency moves onward, because I do think that is a very important thing that will impact a lot of the decisions made within our country, especially judges who will stay in that position for a substantial amount of time and will continue to decide what our laws look like once Biden leaves office.
Yeah, piggybacking off what Elisa said, I definitely agree. I had my regards against Betsy DeVos, the Department of Education. I'm really interested in the education sector of the United States. So who Biden chooses to put into his cabinet, into his office, and his administration, definitely will let me and everyone around me, my constituents, will definitely be focused on what comes next. Because from what I've seen previously with Betsy DeVos's policies, haven't been super interesting, some have been vague. Who Joe Biden allows to come into his administration will definitely say a lot about him moving forward for the next 4 years. Maybe allow him to have another 4 more years as president. So I don't have anything that's unchanged except for who he implements into his administration moving forward.
Well, last time we spoke, the 2 main concerns I identified was the increase in white supremacist hate groups emboldened by Trump's hateful rhetoric and divisiveness. I'm still very much concerned about that, especially if we're thinking about kind of the white backlash, or however we want to term it, pro-Trump backlash to the election results. So definitely still very much on my mind. And the second main thing was concerns about Trump's authoritarian behavior and his praising of dictators. So I would say, even though Biden and Harris have won the popular vote, we all know Trump has not yet conceded, which is not actually required by law. That's not part of the process. That's not something anyone should lose sleep over at night. There's plenty of things to lose sleep over, but maybe that is not the top one on your list, right? So I hope and assume Biden and Harris will still, be able to go in and, assume their duties at the White House as they should under law, under our governing principles. But the fact that Trump is trying to do all these lawsuits, which are pretty much bunk, so I'm not really losing sleep about the lawsuits either, but still just shenanigans around, electoral college and this and that. Like, I don't feel at peace. I don't feel at peace given that he's still in office as a potentially lame duck president until Biden can come in January. So, he still has access to those nuclear codes. Not that I want to make anyone fearful, but when we, think last time I was talking about this aspect of him as an authoritarian dictator type of person. So it's classic to have an election result that one then disputes and says they're going to stay in office. Or I was, my wife was tired and I said, we need to stay up to hear the moment that Trump says he's won the election, even though he hasn't, and we're early on in those election results. So we watched it live and it was rather horrific. So I guess those concerns are still similar. I would say just really quickly, there's a fantastic article in The Guardian that I read talking about how the GOP in the United States now more closely resembles autocratic parties in Hungary and Turkey more than center-right or center-left political parties in Europe. And so I was talking about how this institute in Sweden studied the GOP over the past 20 years and said the way that there's been a demonizing and encouraging of political violence against opponents is much more similar to Hungary, India, Poland, and Turkey. And they cited Trump's encouragement for his supporters to use violence against journalists, political opponents, and I could give you some other statistics. I just don't want to talk too much, but it's a really fantastic article because if we're thinking about 20 years, we're thinking about what predates Trump, and we're thinking about if and when Trump is out of the White House and they do some extermination and whatever and clean up the air and there's a new party, we still have these issues. So I'm still horrified that the GOP senators are not encouraging Trump to accept these results. So my concerns are still similar.
Thank you. I appreciate your honesty as well as your reminder, collective reminder that the vote for the presidency was not just a vote for the president and vice president. It was also about cabinet and judges and a culture and ideology. And so, which is, it's a breath of fresh air to know that these are the things that you all are thinking about coterminously. So we would also like to revisit the question of your faith in our democracy, our political institutions, and our leaders. As you all know, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were declared the winners of the contest on Saturday after 4 turbulent and anxious days. Can you comment on your confidence in our national political systems, given the continued insistence of Trump and many of his supporters that the election has not yet been decided, or worse, that it was somehow stolen?
I would say that my confidence in democracy is placed more on the constituent level, on who goes out to vote, how many people go out to vote, and whether or not people decide to change. Because I really do believe the American system of governments is very much bottom up instead of top down. We do see a lot of change concurrently happen because of people and people raising their voices. And I think that happened this election, as we saw with the huge amount of voter turnout. And I think that ideology that Trump's election was stolen from him is just false, and we shouldn't keep bringing it up, because if you look at the numbers, it is just factual that more people voted for Biden and the Electoral College votes went to him. Furthermore, I would like to say that my faith in democracy on more of a government-based system with elected officials is, I have less faith in them, but I also know that they are put into positions of power because of the people, and if people don't like how they are acting within their positions of power, they can be voted out, and I do have faith that they will be voted out, and I think that's something we have to remember, because midterm elections, I know we just had an election, but midterm elections are 2 years away, and if there's people that you don't like in the House that are not following through on what you believe they should follow through, as constituents, you are allowed to vote them out in 2 years, and I think that's something we have to remember as American people.
Yeah, so with Trump saying that this whole election was stolen from him, I think it's kind of funny. The whole race was to 270 electoral college votes. Biden clearly won that. But my main focus was my faith in the political leaders and institutions. Going back to the Democratic debates we had earlier this year with all the Democratic nominees for president, Kamala Harris and Biden were against each other. And what I thought was interesting was them debating with each other. And Kamala Harris clearly stated in one section, I thought it was interesting. It said on Biden's issue of segregation, busing of public schools, she said, on that issue, I could not be more opposed. And Biden also rebutted by saying her policing department at her time being there was abusing people's rights. So my focus was, how can these two, the vice president and the president, current future vice president and president, make sure that they're not butting heads with each other? How can we ensure that their ideologies don't clash? And who Biden chooses to appoint to his cabinet, how can we ensure that there's no clash of ideologies? I think that's the most important part. I think that's the most important reason why people are looking for our faith. Like most people are looking as a faith in democracy, especially our institutions and leaders. And just seeing them both on the Democratic panel earlier last year, and how they were just opposed most of the things that they had to do with each other, kind of gives me a little bit of pessimism moving forward. Maybe I'm being maybe I am being pessimistic actually, but I think it's more realism, being realistic on the topic.
All right. Well, I would say, kind of building off of what I just said about being concerned about GOP senators trying to perhaps give life to Trump's claims about fraud and how that undermines people's faith in our democratic institutions, also makes us look really foolish abroad, I would say. Those are some concerns I have, along with I don't think his claims are ever going to make it to the Supreme Court or be successful, but it begs the question of the checks and balances in our system, right? And so I have been a little bit horrified with the fact that we've had Trump as president, and I feel like there hasn't been a proper curbing of some of his behavior through Congress people, and in some cases the Supreme Court. And so I'm a little bit worried in terms of thinking if Trump leaves and he's gone, right? But if we're thinking about that article I was just citing in terms of these kinds of rises of fascism and nationalism globally, which has been an increase, and thinking about if certain things are not reformed within our system, I'm concerned about future fascist, dictator-oriented leaders who maybe are smarter and more clever or more experienced. And so I do have some real concerns about our democracy in terms of that. I think we came very close to a constitutional crisis. We maybe still haven't completely avoided. I'm looking forward to trying to restore general norms around constitutionalism and the promise of democracy. I would call it the promise of democracy. I think when we look at voter suppression, when we look at, I said last time, in the United States history, in the US Senate, we've had 1,984 US senators, and only 10 of them are Black, right? So when we think about democracy, it's like those systems of power, who is that representing? And so I never say that we have a democracy. I think that's a promise, right? And so I guess I would just leave it at that.
I think building off of what some others have said, I think some of the conclusions I'm thinking of are similar, but actually, some of the ways that I'm getting there are not. I don't necessarily think it's really a problem, or maybe problem's the wrong word. I don't think it's weird that Donald Trump might want to think that the election was stolen from him. I think that if someone wants to challenge the result of something, if you actually trust the same system, then you trust that the challenge itself would actually still end up giving you the result that you expected. So that's not necessarily a problem. I agree with Melissa in that thinking about politicians sort of coalescing around a certain stance to this is difficult, because that is sort of the same body that ends up adjudicating the validity of it. And so it's difficult to see those people actually taking particular stances. But in a broader sense, if we're actually talking and thinking about trying to do things as a country, I think you really have to hear people out. You actually really do have to think about the fact that whether or not you take it that there's any sort of funny business going on in our democratic system, if almost half the country thinks there is, you actually need to address that as a reality, because it's the reality for half of the people, for such a large portion of the people. And so when you take those things together and you say, look, I'm not saying whatever stance I have. Personally, I don't know much about how you count votes. I don't know much about what would even go into that. I'm sure someone could tell me or show me that there's actually a whole system of checks and balances and there's a whole thing. But I don't know if that really matters, because on the other side of it, if you've got all of these people who feel very strongly that democracy is not working, it's very difficult for democracy to work. And I don't think that that's actually a new thing. I don't think that's a thing that comes up specifically just out of perhaps some Republicans thinking that that's the case in this election. I think this feeling that democracy isn't working is a feeling that lots of people have, and that lots of people have had for the entire time as they've been participants or subjects to democracy, bearing in mind that it's taken a very long time for some people to become participants and to be able to vote as well. And so this suspicion that we might see coming up from Republicans, or people who support a different outcome right now, this suspicion of democracy is actually a suspicion that a lot of people already have and have always had, and that's how they engage in democracy, is at an arm's length, with a sense that you can't necessarily trust this system, but you have to use it. And if we actually take that seriously, we're not really, I don't think, going to go anywhere without letting people feel heard, letting people feel like we're taking it to the point where that could be true. And I don't think it's super new. It might be new for a new block. It might be new for a new group. But I think that feeling that I can't trust what just occurred is actually something that a lot of people fundamentally have in their relationship to American democracy.
Fantastic, Shakir, thank you. And it raises another issue in my experience, which I will spare you all for now, but at some point we could probably talk about it. Before we go on to the next question, I wanted to make a note to our participants that you are now able to register your own questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. So don't be shy. We'll be able to start getting to those in a fairly short period of time. So if you have questions for any or all of the panelists, including follow-up questions to anything that has already been talked about, please do so now. My question to the four of the panelists is this. The last time we met, which was 1 week prior to the election, you each commented on specific changes that you would like to see take place in our public life. Keeping those things in mind, keeping your answers in mind, how will you hold to account the new Biden-Harris administration and their party, the Democratic Party? That is, what will you do as individuals or with others to press for the fulfillment of your stated goals?
Yeah. So from what we've seen from when Trump first came into office was a lot of race-based policies and implementations on immigration, the Muslim ban, the DACA, ICE, and all of these issues that have arisen from that came from his policies. I think it just starts with the state. I think the people who we elect into our state cabinets, into our city officials, those are the ones who carry a lot of say, who have a lot of like I said, just say into if something will pass or not. Because I remember when Trump first implemented the Muslim ban, a judge in Oregon deemed it unconstitutional immediately, and then a bunch of other states followed. And I would hope that when Biden does come into office, and I can assure that when he does come into office, that there's not going to be any race-based immigration policies, because looking at the Muslim ban, it's targeting a lot of people in America who are Arab Americans, not because that they're Muslim, just because they are from, say, certain countries in the Middle East. They're labeled as being Muslim, with kids who are being stripped from their families because they're coming as in like immigrants from Central America and Mexico. They're being stripped from their families, or being put in these little camps. I would hope that Biden's administration, Kamala Harris, would not put these kinds of implementations and these policies in. But another thing that has me questioning is Kamala Harris also being very strict on policing in the state of California, how she has had lots of racist and prejudiced policies that have imprisoned people from for longer sentences, who have prisoned people for just the usage and the possession of marijuana. I want to see how she can come back and not go back against her word, how she can maybe evolve in terms of creating better policies, or creating a better, maybe better prison reform, and policing regulations as well.
I'll follow up from Laith. I think that there's something to be said. I'm kind of in agreement on this sense that, part of seeing what happens to these priorities we have going into this is actually tracking them. And so really actually seeing that what we just did, or what anyone just did, whether or not, whoever they voted for is the president, is the vice president, is if different levels of Congress are leading, or different parties are leading different levels of Congress, that actually tracking that is really important. What we just did was not just electing someone to handle it, and so that now they either do it or they don't. In a way, that sort of follow through is necessary for seeing if that's the case. If there are things that I was paying attention to, I already said this earlier, I pay attention to them whether or not whoever I voted for is in charge of whatever level of Congress or of the government. That, just as a political citizen, if you're trying to see if the things you care about can come to fruition, then you need to try to track them. It's not the same to just engage in the conversation every 4 years and then lament that the direction did not work out the way that you thought it would. You can actually find ways to follow up and keep track of that. That's something that I have tried to do and failed to do and try to do again, and to pay attention to where these things go quickly. It does involve a sort of, I think, an engagement at much more local level politics. I think it's very difficult to sort of feel your connection or the necessity of your voice at the sort of presidential level every day. It's a lot stronger on November 3rd. It's a lot stronger on Election Day. And when we feel that, we actually need to find a way to sort of reproduce that feeling of participating in something that goes up to that level. And I think that can happen, one, at the local level, but two, just at the level of really trying to pay attention to it. I plan to try to pay attention to the things that I told myself were important when I cast my ballot. If I don't actually end up doing that, then I don't know if it's fair to say that I did everything I could on that issue. Mm-hmm. If I were to just check back in 4 years and see if it happened, that seems maybe not the best way to do everything I can do. Not that everything I can do will necessarily get it done. It takes a lot of people, and it actually takes a lot of people have different kinds of power in different ways. So sometimes you do it anyway, and it does not work. But at least at that point, I could feel like I did what I can do to track a certain issue or a certain process.
That's great, Shakir.
All right, I'm up next. So I think, the short answer is I'll still be taking to the streets under a Biden-Harris presidency, even though I voted for them, right? So, the struggles are going to continue. And so I think, when we think about holding accountable, it very much does depend on what the particular issues are that motivate us, that we're paying attention to. So, last time we met, I talked a lot about LGBTQ activism. That's still something, I would say is very important to me. Alongside that, I didn't talk about this last time, but definitely gun violence prevention movement is something very near and dear to my own heart. We, 6 years ago, had a tragedy where 6 of our students were killed in a violent rampage. And since then, I've worked with a lot of communities that have experienced mass shootings and gun violence. And so for that, it's a little easier for me to think national in terms of participating with organizations that are doing that work. There's a number of national organizations I work with. And, you know, I've been able to do some events, like we had a large concert at the Arlington Theater we did to raise awareness. And I've taken to the streets with the fathers of victims from our tragedy and, you know, gone door to door in Isla Vista trying to get out the vote with one of the fathers of one of our students who was killed. And so for me, it's both the local as well as thinking about national organizations you can be involved in. But in terms of my own emotional fulfillment, I tend to gravitate towards things where I get to interact with people or see an actual impact of something that I do in a very visceral way. And so I think for me, you know, activism is kind of a way of life all the time. It's not just about a presidential election every 4 years, but also I'd say as a historian and also from my training in law school, it is so powerful thinking about the ways that people can rise up and affect change. Just thinking about Black Lives Matter movement and nationally, internationally, thinking about the civil rights movement, thinking about a lot of these kinds of moments where you're really kind of pushing a needle. And so I do think that, you know, as much as we talk about the president, the Supreme Court, the Senate, those are all important things, but we also have to think about the fact that even protest influences the Supreme Court, right? I could tell you a bunch of books about like how that actually impacts Supreme Court justices, right? And also voting, you know, I mean, not just voting, but activism in the everyday moment in terms of thinking about educating others. So I guess that's how I'd answer that.
Just to piggyback off of what everybody else is saying, I agree that there are a lot of things you can take action with, whether that be community-based organizations or national-based organizations, in order to keep your voice heard throughout the presidency. And voting is one way to make sure your voice is heard, but there are other steps you can take in order to ensure that you are heard from people in every level of government. Because if you really think about it, you can call your representatives from the House or the Senate that are going to vote on a bill, and if enough people do that, that'll probably sway their vote. And you can do that through community organization, and that's really important. That's not to say that every single person in America has the ability to do that, but even if a vast majority do, that's still very impactful. And even if you can only vote every 4 years because you only have time to vote during elections, that's still impactful and you're still having your voice heard. So I think there's various steps you can take in order to be active within politics that ensure that you are being heard from your officials and keep them accountable. And if that's just voting, then that's fine. Then you're still doing your role. And even if it's just talking to one person that doesn't vote and making sure they vote in the next election when they've never voted before, that's still very impactful, because I do believe that every vote does count. And so even just that step to ensure people are having their voices heard through voting is important. And if you want to take more steps through grassroots organization or community organization or national organizations, you can also do that, as Melissa spoke to.
Thank you for that. And that is a perfect segue to what will be our last question before we take field questions from the audience. So as we know, this election witnessed a record-breaking number of votes cast, suggesting perhaps a new level of civic engagement among the American electorate. Are you hopeful about our ability to sustain this level of engagement? What do you intend to do to help to sustain it?
I guess building off of what I was talking about, I think it is very impressive how many people turned out to vote this election, and it does make me very hopeful for years to come. I think one of the things we did see in this election, though, was the continuous rhetoric that this election would be focused on what America is in this election. How you voted would determine how the ideology of America in total, whether or not you voted for Trump or whether or not you voted for Biden. And I think that rhetoric made a lot of people vote because they thought this was such an important election. And I am a little bit worried that in elections to come, if there aren't two partisan candidates or two candidates that are believed to be pushing different extremist viewpoints of the United States, that more people wouldn't show up because they wouldn't believe it was as important. But I am very hopeful in all the activist groups, especially we saw Stacey Abrams in Georgia registered 800,000 people to vote that hadn't voted previously, and that was monumental. And I think if work like that continues to happen, we will continue to see voter engagement increase and people turn out to vote on elections. I don't know if that's true for midterm elections or for local elections. Those always tend to have lower voter turnouts than presidential elections, but I am hopeful that civic engagement will continue to increase, especially since people are starting to focus on registering people to vote and getting out the vote in communities that either couldn't vote for a substantial period of time or didn't vote, such as my age demographic, for example. 18 to 25-year-olds often don't vote in general elections, and we saw a huge spike in them coming out to vote for this election. And that's very impressive to me and makes me very hopeful that that will continue to happen for other elections.
I'll follow up on that. I feel like, you know, it was interesting. There were so many factors in why the way that we would vote would be different. The way that lots of people would vote, the extended amount of time people had to vote, the various methods, and I think it might speak to maybe what's a more fundamental question of if we are trying to, if we as a nation are trying to maximize civic engagement. Are there things we can do to actually help that happen? I think that we see that that's something we can help happen. I don't personally take too much to the idea that everybody felt like the world was falling apart and that's why they voted. One, I think people always kind of think the world's falling apart, and I think that that's not a particularly new thing, but that when you change the methods for which people can actually engage in politics, you get a different result. We had lots of different reasons for doing so, and it would be a shame to see some of those go away. I feel like I would be more than willing to try to support any effort to keep a diversity of means for participation on the table, because I think that is a good way to try to keep that engagement at that level. And that and then to sort of, not that anyone here said this, but just that is, you know, some of the rhetoric out there, that the reason is not because of the methods and it's more because of the actual nature of our time right now. I don't know if that's as helpful as paying attention to the ways that we allow people to engage. I think there's more we can do to allow people to engage, and that if a democratic process is really what we want, we need some diversity in those methods. And it's been a slow process over the history of the US to really bring in other ways to have people participate, to bring in other kinds of people who can participate. We had a proposition on the California ballot right now to bring in another body to participate in the election, as in people who had served their time in penitentiary. And, you know, just that I think there's things we can do there to think about who's being cut out. I think Georgia was a very important case of the kinds of efforts you can make to really let that happen. But I think it does rest on the methods to a certain extent. And, you know, personally on my end, I would look out for those and support and try to do anything that allows other methods that work to be a part of the process. And the ways that the methods are sometimes laid out are shifting that participation in a way that sometimes gets ignored.
Yeah. Me personally, I think I have two takes on it. Maybe a realistic side would possibly look at the complacency, maybe moving forward. Now that we do have a different president and Trump isn't going to take office, some people might just be a little lax and just laid back, like, okay, well, let's just ride this out for the next 4 years. Maybe civic engagement might go down because, yeah, we got what we wanted. A new president in office and new implementations and regulations. I'm optimistic, though, that it will definitely create more civic engagement in the future generations, because with the 2016 and 2020 election, even for Hillary Clinton, when she was out, she had obviously majority of the popular vote, and then Trump only won because of the Electoral College. I think that will definitely go down in history books for kids growing up, learning, because I remember learning about the Electoral College when I was in middle school. these two past elections are definitely going to go down in history, especially for younger kids, understanding what politics is, understanding how to vote. Because one is a great example of, okay, you don't have majority rules, but just because we have the electoral college system, he won. And now we have, and then this election, almost 4 to 5 million more popular votes for Biden. And on top of it, he completely wiped the board with the electoral college by flipping, Virginia went blue, Pennsylvania blue, Georgia blue, North Carolina on the brink of being blue, previously red states. So I think these past two elections are definitely going to speak levels moving forward in understanding and pushing people to be more engaged in politics, be more aware in what's going on, especially if it's, maybe it may not be on the whole domestic level of the whole state. It can definitely start, not state, the whole country. It will definitely start in your state, because your state, your city, your local governments will impact you, your family, your education. And then moving forward on the bigger scale, you'll understand more what happens with, for example, the Department of Education, what curriculums you're going to be learning in school, environmental problems, why we pulled out of the Paris Agreement. So I definitely think that there's going to be more civic engagement, but then again, a part of me is saying, maybe not. Maybe we're going to be more complacent. Maybe we're just going to lay back and just see how these next 4 years ride out, and possibly have Joe Biden for the next 4 years following an 8-year term. I'm not too sure. I think there's two sides for it, but I'm hopeful to see where it goes for the next generation of voters.
So I think, there's a number of factors we can look to in terms of the particular time and kind of such divisiveness and these two stark contrasts in terms of so many more people voting. I think COVID created an interesting situation in that people had to be more creative in some of the processes by which of getting out the vote and having people turn in their ballots. I think that it was either Trevor Noah or MSNBC, I can't remember, but they had a whole list of different things that happened with people voting this election cycle than some of the previous cycles, right? So I think, part of it has to do with accessibility for people. If you're working a full-time job, you can't go to the polls and wait 6 hours because the powers that be have tried to gerrymander or manipulate the system so that there's fewer people staffing it, fewer equipment, things like that. And so basically, I would say that one kind of positive thing is that perhaps we can look at what enabled, like in terms of just practical matter, more people to be able to vote, right? And so part of it is motivating and encouraging, but part of it is like actual just logistically being able to vote. I would say that, it also is a situation where we have to think about this not just happening, like the sacrifices of people like Stacey Abrams going and just, working so hard to get more people to the polls, right? Just on Facebook, thinking about the number of friends I have who are poll workers, phone banking, donating money, raising things, funds to be able to go to certain areas, and just the amount of engagement I saw even on Facebook was really different among my own friend groups, right? And so I guess, I'm just very mindful too of just the sacrifices of specific groups of people like Black women in Georgia working really hard to kind of turn out the vote. And, I'm still horrified by the U.S. Supreme Court gutting Section 4 of the 1964 Voting Rights Act. Like, there's still structural things being done that create impediments to fulfilling those lofty dreams or promises of a democracy. So I guess I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. I hope, people continue to vote in large numbers, but I'm also really hoping for more structural change and more widespread introspection about how our system is and is not operating for all people.
Okay, Thank you all. We have time for a couple of more questions that have been submitted to us. And the first two actually go to our faculty speakers. You thought you were off the hook, but think again. So the first one goes to Terrance. And somebody has asked if you can speak more about the backlash that you mentioned in an earlier answer. For example, backlash against Black Lives Matters and how that fits into the larger conversation we're having.
Yeah, so actually, so Kara Anderson has a book. I think a lot of people are telling people to, encouraging folks to read multiple kinds of things. You might have heard of Ibram Kendi's Stamped Out. You might have heard of the White Fragility book. But Carol Anderson wrote this amazing book called White Rage, where she historicizes basically progress that Black people have made. Speaking of the Civil Rights Act, right? So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the fact that that was part of Black African American, but also a coalitional politic to get the Civil Rights Act passed. That came with backlash, that Black communities were targeted, killed, violated. The Tulsa riots prior to, right? You're talking about the fact that even in the Reconstruction era, right, which gave us our first Black U.S. senators, and right, that was also the moment in which the KKK was founded. It's also the moment in which lynching becomes a predominant tool to police Black people, right? So that we know that there's a history of, and that this is the ushering in of Jim Crow law, right? That we know that there's a history that when Black people and people of color, largely when women of color, Black and brown women, queer, trans folks get rights, there is a particular, it's almost like I will call it an immoral panic and backlash that comes, that is deeply racialized, because so much of this, the organizing that has happened on the ground for rights that have actually helped multiple Americans have been through Black community organizing, and so then they become the necessary targets because they also have very few protections, right? And so in the way in which this gets tied into the police being part of facilitating this, the FBI, like the CIA, these are not conspiracy theories. These are well documented histories of coordinated efforts to actually to violate Black folks, and we're seeing this. And with the impunity with police officers get to murder Black life. So and how even on, Melissa had brought about Facebook, how there's a circulation of Black Lives Matter actually being articulated as burn, loot, murder. That Black Lives Matter has been articulated as a terrorist organization, despite white supremacist organizations being named as domestic terrorists. So there's this misaligning that has articulated Black folks as threatening, that is a long historical from the colonial peril and Black peril on the continent of Africa, that aligned Black folks with criminal subjects. And therefore the things that we do, even in the name of creating a progressive future for our world, gets read as somehow criminalizable. So I'm not actually surprised that the discourse about illegal votes is coming in these spaces where it's Black people who are exercising their right to vote, because they could through mail-in systems, because we've long had processes that denied Black people the right to vote or created impediments to their voting. And then when we name the hyper-criminalization of Black people and then the denial of prisoners the right to vote, like it's a deeply racialized system. And I'm concerned that what's going to happen is those 71 plus million people and all of the senators and representatives that they elected are going to figure out a way, as they have been, to actually curtail all of this, and which is going to lead to a kind of reversal of history, but is a maintenance of a kind of racialized hierarchy. And that's what I'm concerned about, and that's what's at stake for me moving forward, much more than a question of will the Senate turn blue or not. It's not going to turn blue because they're two independents, but who will have control of the Senate? It's really a question of what will happen when those 71 million plus folks decide that this is not enough. Those Proud Boys did not go away. We had a governor's life threatened, right? One of the organizers for Black Lives Matter Alicia Garza had a knock at her door and was informed by the FBI that her name was on a hit list by white supremacists. it's happening right now.
Mhm.
And it's the question, my concern is it's going to happen in droves and we don't have a response to it because all of our eyes are on these larger questions about like, will Biden become the president? Will Trump concede? And we're not really paying attention to the everyday violences that are just being expedited through the lives of Black and brown folks.
And that backlash and its many manifestations has been, to my mind, emboldened by the person living in the White House. And so they've come out from under the rocks under which they used to live. And they shamelessly carry their AK-45s or whatever in the streets to deliberately frighten people. And that's backlash on testosterone, essentially. Our last question, because we're running out of time, will go to Salim Yaqub. And somebody asked about Russian interference in the 2016 election and similar, which was founded, by the way, and similar seemingly founded calls by intelligence agencies in the United States warning that Russian and other agents were not just trying to, but were actively subverting the electoral system. And this person has asked for you to spend a couple of minutes commenting on that, if you would.
Yeah, so I gather the entire question is centered on the 2016 election, so I'll focus on that. And yes, it was pretty well documented at the time, although we learned more in subsequent months and years, that the Russian government and figures working in collaboration with it, ostensibly private citizens with their own bot accounts, but clearly working at Russia's behest, did interfere in the election in this sense. I don't think there's any instance of their successfully hacking into the voting systems, but rather hacking into the email accounts of Democratic Party officials, and in particular campaign officials, people connected to Hillary Clinton's campaign. They hacked into those email accounts, turned those emails over to WikiLeaks, which was also working in cahoots with the Russians, and then WikiLeaks released them. And basically, what these emails contained were private conversations over email among members of Hillary's inner circle. Now, there was nothing particularly incriminating from a legal standpoint, but they were basically speaking privately, candidly, snarking about people that they were irritated by. They said some casual things about American Catholics that could easily be dressed up to, as anti-Catholic bigotry, even though I think the person making the supposedly anti-Catholic comment was himself or herself Catholic. Anyway, so in the thing, the effectiveness of this was that it became a national news story. I mean, the media picked it up because it was very titillating, and it's, and there's this impulse to just seize on something that's confidential that has been released and not question how relevant it is to the issues in the campaign, but rather, just because you got a scoop, you spend a lot of time and space on it, and that created this impression of a campaign in disarray, the Clinton campaign, of a candidate who was herself, deeply compromised morally. And so this was all given the same or even more weight than some of the clear deficiencies of Donald Trump. And so that, in retrospect, it seems pretty clear that helped create we can't say for sure what it did to the votes, but it presumably diminished some of Hillary Clinton's support. And since the election was, so incredibly close, I mean, it ultimately turned on several thousand votes in 3 states, that may well have made the difference. And I should just say that one final thing, if there's time, is that the Obama administration was aware of this and wanted to make an issue of it, but it didn't want to do so only in its own name, because then it would seem partisan. It would seem as if it were putting its thumb on the scale to protect a Democratic candidate. So Obama tried to get Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, to join the Obama administration in a statement alerting the citizenry to this problem, but McConnell refused because he recognized the partisan advantage that this kind of interference was giving to the Trump campaign.
Thank you, Salim. We are just about out of time. So aside from the enormously helpful and thoughtful and insightful answers we've received this evening, many questions, of course, are left to be unaddressed. I would like to call your attention to two articles that I think may be of help in sort of ferreting out these ideas. The first is really about the threat to democracy, and it's a recent article by Adam Serwer in The Atlantic, came out a couple of days ago. And Serwer in this article suggests quite convincingly that although we appear to have survived this recent threat to our democracy, and in particular to the electoral process, through all those ways that I articulated in my introduction, and then some. The crisis of American democracy, he says, is not over. So I call your attention to his November 8th article in The Atlantic. Secondly, with regard to the apparently intractable differences that separate two factions of the American electorate, you may want to read Claudia Dean's and John Gramlich's study from the Pew Research Center, and that just came out recently. So it's a little light reading for you to put all of this in context. I'd like to say a few things. Our intent is to make these events, that is the 1026 event and today's, just the beginning of a series of conversations that will go on among students, faculty, and community members across UCSB and Santa Barbara and beyond while we're living in Zoom. And if any of you listening, or any of your friends, or any of you here have ideas, please feel free to contact us, and we'd be happy to hear you and hear your ideas. We really do, as the CAP Center, want to be part of an ongoing conversation related to all of these manifold issues that are vexing, but seem less vexing when we get together and talk them through and break them down into little bits. Also, please remember that this Thursday, 11/12 at 6 p.m., Carla Fredericks will be here. That's also going to be, it is posted on our Facebook page and will be on post on Twitter and Instagram tomorrow. And finally, for any of you who are here who are not on our mailing list, you may go to our website at capcenter.ucsb.edu and sign up for our events. And a final big thank you to all of you, to Elisa, Salim, Shakir, Terrance, Melissa, and Laith, as well as all of the others whom I thanked earlier who have sponsored us and also given us technical and really helpful expert advice throughout putting these two events together. I think it's been really great. On a personal note, I will say that it's helped me calm the heck down about what's going on in Washington to just talk to people and talk it through, because I think we've been through 4 years, or at least 1 week, but more like 4 years of extraordinarily high level of anxiety that is only sustainable for so long. So that's part of the reason that I appreciate having the chance to talk to all of you. And I hope for more such conversations in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you again very much. We really, really appreciate it. It's great to see you, my friends.
See you all. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, May, for all your great work as well. I know.
Thank you,
Yeah,
May.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was great.
I'll be calling you all up again in the future for more help.
Okay.
Okay,
All
good
right.
night, everybody. Thank you.